The iron bars burned against Ophelia's palms as she pressed her face between them. Watching the crowd of leering men circle her cage like vultures, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty market square of Millbrook Valley, his words cutting through her like broken glass. "What am I bid for this fine specimen? Young, strong, and untouched." Ophelia's emerald eyes blazed with fury despite the fear coursing through her veins. 3 days ago, she'd been free, living in the mountain cabin. Her grandmother had left her. Then the debt collectors came, claiming she owed money for taxes she'd never heard of. When she couldn't pay, they declared her property of the state hand. The state had a lucrative side business. $50, called a gap-toothed merchant. "$75," shouted a rancher with hands like ham hocks. The bidding climbed higher, and Ophelia's stomach churned. She'd heard whispers of what happened to girls sold at these auctions. Some became servants if they were lucky. Others disappeared into the mountains, never to be seen again. That's when she saw him. A man unlike the others pushed through the crowd, his weathered leather coat dusty from the trail. Dark hair fell across his forehead, partially shadowing eyes, the color of storm clouds. He moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger, and the crowd instinctively parted before him. $100. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. The auctioneer's eyes lit up greedily. "I have 100. Do I hear 200? The stranger's tone carried a finality that silenced the square. Ophelia stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at her like she was livestock. His gaze held something else, recognition. She couldn't tell. The auctioneer waited, scanning the crowd for higher bids. But the other men had melted away. $200 was more than most of them made in a year. Sold to the gentleman in the leather coat. As the stranger approached her cage, counting out gold coins, Ophelia pressed herself against the far bars. "What do you want with me?" she whispered. He looked up from paying the auctioneer, and for a moment, their eyes met. His were tired, haunted by something she couldn't name. "Name's Caspian Wolf," he said quietly. "And I'm getting you out of here." The cage door swung open with a rusty screech. Caspian held out his hand, but Ophelia hesitated. She'd learned not to trust men easily, especially not ones who bought women at auctions. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he said, his voice softer now. "But I give you my word, I mean you no harm." Something in his tone made her believe him. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Ophelia took his hand. His fingers were calloused from years of hard living, but his grip was gentle. "Why?" she asked as he helped her down from the platform. Caspian's jaw tightened. "Because nobody deserves to be sold like cattle." He glanced around the dispersing crowd with disgust. "My horse is at the livery. We leave now," as they walked away from the auction block. Ophelia felt the weight of curious and angry stares following them. She'd been saved. But she had no idea what fate awaited her with this mysterious drifter who'd spent a fortune to free a stranger. The mare beneath Ophelia was strong and sure-footed, but she'd never ridden astride before. Her threadbare dress had torn further as Caspian helped her mount, and now she gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles as they climbed the winding mountain trail. "Where are we going?" she called over the wind. Caspian rode slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the path and tree line. "Somewhere safe. Those men at the auction won't be happy about losing their prize, especially Jeremiah Blackthorne." The name sent ice through Ophelia's veins. She'd heard stories about Blackthorne, the self-proclaimed king of Millbrook Valley, who owned half the businesses and most of the politicians. He was there, big man with the silver beard and fancy vest. "He bid against me until the price got too rich for his blood." Caspian's voice hardened. "He's got a reputation for collecting pretty things." They rode in silence for another hour, the sun beginning its descent behind the pine-covered peaks. Ophelia studied the man who'd bought her freedom, trying to understand his motives. He sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, and she noticed the way his hand never strayed far from the gun at his hip. "You're not from around here," she observed, double quotes. "No, I drift where the work takes me." He glanced back at her. "What about you? How'd you end up in that cage?" Ophelia's throat tightened. My grandmother died last winter. I thought the cabin was mine free and clear, but then the tax collectors came. Said I owed $300 in back taxes.
Ah!
She laughed bitterly. Might as well have been $3,000. I barely make enough selling her herb remedies to buy flour and salt, so they took everything. Everything. The word came out as a whisper, including me. As twilight painted the sky purple, they reached a small clearing with a creek running through it. Caspian dismounted and began unsaddling the horses. We'll camp here tonight. Too dangerous to travel these trails in the dark. Ophelia slid down from her mare, her legs trembling from the unaccustomed ride. She watched Caspian work, noting the practiced efficiency of his movements. This was a man who'd spent many nights under the stars. I can help, she offered. He looked surprised. You sure? Most ladies, I'm not most ladies. She began gathering kindling. And I won't be a burden. Something shifted in his expression of approval, maybe even respect, as they worked together. To set up camp, Ophelia found herself stealing glances at him. He was handsome in a rough, untamed way, but it was more than that. There was a gentleness in how he handled the horses, a careful way he moved around her that spoke of a man trying not to frighten an already traumatized woman. When the fire was crackling and coffee brewing in a dented pot, Caspian pulled hardtack and jerky from his saddlebags. It wasn't much, but Ophelia hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Thank you, she said, accepting the simple meal. Not just for the food, for everything. Caspian stared into the flames. Don't thank me yet. We've got a long way to go before you're truly safe. Safe where? My sister lives in Sage Springs, about 3 days' ride north. She runs a boarding house for ladies, good women who've had hard luck. He met her eyes across the fire.
Baz!
She'll give you work, a place to stay, a chance to start over. Ophelia felt. Tears prick her eyes. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Caspian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with old pain. Younger than you. She got sold at an auction in Kansas when I was away working cattle. By the time I found out, it was too late. His hands clenched into fists. I swore I'd never let it happen again if I could help it. The fire crackled between them, and Ophelia understood. This mysterious drifter was trying to save someone he couldn't save before. The gunshot echoed through the canyon at dawn, sending birds screaming from the pines. Ophelia jerked awake to find Caspian already on his feet, pistol drawn, scanning the ridgeline above their camp. Get behind the rocks, he ordered, his voice deadly calm. She scrambled to the boulder pile near the creek as another shot rang out. This one closer. The bullet sparked off stone inches from where she crouched. Caspian Wolf. The voice boomed down from the ridge. You got something that belongs to me, Blackthorn? Ophelia's blood turned to ice water. She's not property, Caspian called back, positioning himself behind a fallen log. The auction was legal. Legal don't make it right. You know what I paid for exclusive bidding rights on that girl? Rifles glinting in the morning sun. They were surrounded. Here's what's going to happen, Blackthorn continued. You're going to walk away from this, and we're going to take the girl back where she belongs. You do that, and maybe you live to see another sunset. Caspian's jaw tightened. He glanced at Ophelia, and she saw the calculation in his storm-gray eyes. 4 men, high ground, good cover. The odds were impossible. Go, she whispered. Save yourself. His answer was to check his ammunition and settle deeper behind the log. Not happening. The battle erupted without warning. Blackthorn's men opened. Fire from both ridges, bullets whining off rocks and splintering trees. Caspian returned fire with measured precision, making every shot count. Ophelia pressed herself against the stone, heart hammering as the fight raged around her. She'd never been in a gunfight before, but she could tell Caspian was outmatched. He was good better than good, but he couldn't watch both ridges at once. A bullet tugged at her hair. She realized one of the shooters had flanked around to the creek bed. In desperation, she grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it at his head just as he took aim at Caspian's back. The stone caught him above the ear with a meaty thud. He dropped his rifle and tumbled into the water, unconscious. Nice throw, Caspian called without taking his eyes off the remaining shooters. The tide began to turn. With one man down, Caspian could focus his fire more effectively. Otava, Blackthorn's hired guns cried out and disappeared behind the ridge, clutching his shoulder. This ain't over. Blackthorn's voice carried rage and frustration. I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. The shooting stopped. Hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls as the survivors retreated. Caspian remained frozen behind cover for long minutes, listening. Finally, he holstered his gun and turned to Ophelia. Blood seeped through his shirt sleeve. You're hurt, she gasped, rushing to him. Just a graze. Duh. But his face was pale beneath his tan. Ophelia tore strips from her already damaged dress, creating makeshift bandages. As she worked her hands steady, despite everything, she felt Caspian's eyes on her. You saved my life back there, he said quietly. You saved mine first. She tied off the bandage, her fingers lingering on his arm longer than necessary. We're even. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition deeper than gratitude. Ophelia felt her pulse quicken as Caspian's hand covered hers. Need to keep moving, he said, but his voice was rougher now. Blackthorn will be back with more men. As they broke camp, Ophelia caught herself watching the way Caspian moved, the strength in his shoulders as he lifted the saddles. The morning's danger had stripped away pretense between them, leaving something raw and honest. When he helped her mount, his hands spanned her waist completely. For a heartbeat, they were pressed close together, and she could smell leather and gunpowder and something uniquely him. Ophelia, he said, and her name sounded different in his voice. Yes, thank you. We're staying. We're fighting. She looked down at him, this mysterious drifter who'd risked everything for a stranger, and felt something shift inside her chest like a key turning in a lock. Thank you for giving me something worth fighting for. They rode hard that day, pushing deeper into the mountains, but Ophelia no longer felt like she was running away from something. She was running toward whatever this was growing between them. The cabin appeared through the pine. Trees like something from a fairy tale, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the crisp mountain air. Ophelia's breath caught as they approached. The small homestead nestled in a hidden valley. Whose place is this? She asked, sliding down from her mare with more confidence than she'd had days before. Caspian's expression grew complicated. Mine was mine anyway. He began unsaddling the horses with mechanical precision. Haven't been back in 3 years. The cabin was modest but well built, with a covered porch and shuttered windows. A vegetable garden, now wild with weeds, stretched behind it toward a small barn. It looked like the kind of place where a man might put down roots. Why did you leave? He carried their gear to the porch but didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was carefully neutral. Bad memories seemed easier to keep moving. Inside, dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, preserved by the dry mountain air. Ophelia ran her fingers along the mantelpiece, noting the feminine touches: embroidered curtains, a flower vase, a woman's shawl still draped over one chair. Lived. Here with you, she said softly. It wasn't a question. Caspian's jaw tightened. Clara, we were... ... He stopped, shaking his head. It doesn't matter now, but Ophelia could see it did matter very much. She watched him move through the space like a ghost revisiting his own life, touching objects that clearly held painful significance. What happened to her? Fever took her that last winter. I couldn't get her to a doctor in time. The snow was too deep, and by the time it cleared, he sat heavily in one of the chairs, suddenly looking older than his years. Ophelia's heart ached for him. She understood now why he'd been drifting, why he'd saved her from the auction. He was trying to outrun his grief, seeking redemption, and helping others because he couldn't help the one who mattered most. I'm sorry, she whispered. So am I. He looked up at her, and the raw pain in his eyes made her breath catch. I failed her, Ophelia, just like I failed my sister. It's just like I'll probably fail you. Moved without thinking, crossing to kneel beside his chair. You haven't failed me. You saved me. for now. But Blackthorn won't give up. It's got men, money, connections. Eventually, Ophelia silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. The contact sent electricity shooting through both of them. Then we'll face whatever comes together, she said. His hand came up to cover hers, and suddenly the air between them crackled with tension that had been building for days. She was close enough to see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Ophelia, he said, and her name was a prayer on his lips. She leaned closer, drawn by forces she didn't fully understand. Other hand cupped her face with infinite gentleness, and she realized she was trembling, not with fear this time, but with want. When their lips met, it was like coming home and embarking on an adventure all at once. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but when she pressed closer, it deepened into something hungry and desperate. 3 years of loneliness met a lifetime of isolation, and the spark between them blazed into flame. They broke apart, both breathing. Hard, this is... ... double quotes Caspian started. Complicated, she finished. Yes, but neither of them moved away. Instead, Ophelia found herself studying his face like she was memorizing it, the strong line of his jaw. Oh, the way his dark hair fell. Across his forehead, the scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone. How did you get this? She asked, tracing the old wound with her fingertip. Bar fight in Deadwood. Disagreement over a card game. He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his chest, where she could feel his heart hammering. Ophelia, you should know I'm not a good man. I've done things. So have I, she interrupted. I killed a man once, okay? A trapper who tried to force himself on me. Hit him with a cast-iron skillet and caved in his skull. Caspian's eyes widened slightly then, filled with something that might have been admiration. Did you bury him? Fed him to the pigs? A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. I'm beginning to think you're exactly the right kind of dangerous, Miss Ophelia. Thunder rolled across the valley as rain began to drum against the cabin's tin roof. They'd been at the homestead for 2 days. And despite the looming threat of Blackthorn's return, Ophelia had never felt safer, or more confused about her feelings. She stood at the kitchen window, watching Caspian repair the barn door that had come loose in the storm. Even through the rain, she could see the fluid strength in his movements, the way his wet shirt clung to his shoulders. When he'd stripped off his coat that morning and rolled up his sleeves, she'd had to look away before she did something foolish, like kiss him again. That first kiss had opened something between them that neither seemed to know how to handle. They moved around each other now with careful politeness, but the air crackled with unspoken desire every time they accidentally brushed hands or caught each other staring. The cabin door opened with a gust of wind and rain. Caspian stepped inside, water streaming from his dark hair, and Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. His white shirt was nearly transparent from the soaking, and she could see every muscle of his chest and abdomen outlined beneath the clinging fabric. Getting rough out there, he said, seemingly oblivious to her wide-eyed stare. Good thing we're secure in here. Ophelia nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. She busied herself stirring the stew that had been simmering all afternoon. Skill her grandmother had taught her using wild herbs and vegetables they'd found in the overgrown garden. Smells incredible, Caspian said, moving up behind her to peer over her shoulder. His body heat warmed her back, and she caught the scent of rain and leather and that uniquely masculine smell that made her head spin. When he reached around her to sample the stew, his chest pressed against her shoulder blades, and she nearly dropped the wooden spoon. Careful, he murmured, his hands coming up to steady hers on the pot handle. The simple contact sent fire racing through her veins. She turned in his arms without thinking, finding herself trapped between his body and the stove. His gray eyes had darkened to the color of storm clouds, and she could see her own desire reflected there. Ophelia, he said, his voice rough. I know this is complicated, she whispered. I know you're still grieving, Clara, and I know I'm supposed to be grateful you saved me. But he silenced her with a kiss that was nothing like their first tentative exploration.
Oh.
This was hunger and need, and 3 days of mounting tension finally given release. His hands tangled in her hair and she pressed against him, marveling at the solid strength of his body. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I don't want your gratitude," he said fiercely. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation or guilt or trying to save Clara through you." "What do you feel?" she asked, even though her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could. Here, instead of answering with words, he showed her. His lips found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder, and she gasped at the sensation. Her hands found the buttons of his wet shirt, fumbling with them until she could slide her palms across the warm skin of his chest. A crash of thunder shook the cabin, but neither of them noticed. There was only the taste of rain on his skin, the way his hands spanned her waist, the desperate need building between them like the storm outside. "Are you sure?" he asked against her throat. Her answer was to pull his head down for another kiss. She'd never been with a man before, had never wanted to be but with Caspian. Desire felt as natural as breathing. He lifted her icily, carrying her to the bedroom as lightning illuminated the windows. The bed was simple, covered with one of Clara's quilts, but Ophelia didn't think about the other woman. There was only now. Only this man who'd risked everything for her and was looking at her like she was precious beyond measure. Their lovemaking was tender and passionate and gentle all at once. Caspian worshipped her body with reverent touches, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, and Ophelia discovered that she was braver than she'd ever imagined. Bold enough to show him exactly how much she wanted him. Afterward they lay, entwined as the storm raged outside, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to normal. "I love you," she said into the darkness, the words surprising them both. His arms tightened around her. "I love you too. God help us both, but—" "I do." She lifted her head to look at him. "What happens now?" "Now we figure out how to stay alive long enough to have a future together." As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses reached them through the storm. Caspian was on his feet instantly, reaching for his gun as torchlight flickered outside. The windows. Blackthorn had found them. "Back window," Caspian whispered, pulling on his pants as hoofbeats circled the cabin. "There's a trail that leads up to the ridge. Follow it to the old mine shaft and wait for me there." Ophelia dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she laced her boots. Through the rain-lashed windows, she could see the glow of torches surrounding the cabin. Too many to count. "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely. "Ophelia, no." She grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace mantel, checking to make sure it was loaded. "We faced this together, remember?" Before he could argue, Blackthorn's voice boomed through the storm. "Wolf, I know you're in there with my property. Come out peaceful-like, and maybe I'll let you live." Caspian positioned himself at the front window, motioning for Ophelia to take the side window that faced the barn. In the flickering torchlight, she could see at least 8 men spread around the clearing. "She's not your property," Caspian called back. "The auction was legal. Legal ain't the same as right. You know what that girl cost me? Time, money, favors owed. And then you come along and snatch her right out from under me." Bottle crashed through the kitchen window, shattering glass across the floor. The smell of kerosene filled the cabin. "Fire," Ophelia breathed. Another bottle came through the bedroom window, then another. Flames began to lick along the wooden walls as the kerosene caught. "Last chance, Wolf. Send out the girl, or you both burn." The cabin was filling with smoke. Caspian made a decision that would have terrified Ophelia days ago, but now filled her with fierce pride. He kicked open the front door and stepped onto the porch. Guns blazing, the night erupted in gunfire. Ophelia aimed through the side window and squeezed the trigger, her shot taking down one of Blackthorn's men as he tried to circle around behind Caspian. The recoil knocked her backward, but she levered another round and kept firing. Caspian was magnificent in the firelight, moving like a deadly dancer as he picked off targets with surgical precision. But there were too many of them, and the cabin was becoming an inferno. "The barn," he shouted over the gunfire. "Run." They sprinted across the clearing together, bullets whining around them.
One tugged at Ophelia's skirt.
Another splintered the barn door, just as Caspian yanked it open. Ow. They dove inside as the structure around them exploded with gunfire. "There's another way out," Caspian said, leading her to the back of the barn, where a loose board created a narrow gap. "The mine trail starts just beyond those rocks." But as they squeezed through the opening, Blackthorn himself stepped out of the shadows, a massive Colt revolver trained on Ophelia's chest. Well, well, look what crawled out of the woodwork. Caspian's gun was already rising, but Blackthorn was faster. The big revolver swung toward him. "Drop it, or I put a bullet in your woman." Time slowed. Ophelia saw Caspian's face go through. A series of calculations saw him weigh her life against their chances of survival. She knew he would drop his gun, knew he would sacrifice himself for her just like he'd been unable to do for Clara. She couldn't let that happen. Moving faster than she'd ever moved in her life, Ophelia dove sideways just as Blackthorn's finger tightened on the trigger. The bullet meant for her chest caught him in the shoulder instead, spinning him around, but not dropping him. Caspian's return shot took Blackthorn's center mass, dropping the big man like a felled tree. The remaining gunmen scattered when they saw their leader fall. Melting back into the storm-dark forest like the cowards they'd always been, Ophelia pressed her hand to her shoulder, feeling blood seep between her fingers. The bullet had torn through muscle and flesh but missed anything vital. "How bad?" Caspian asked, examining the wound by flickering firelight from the burning cabin. "I'll live." She looked at the destruction of his home, guilt washing over her. "I'm sorry. This place, your memories of Clara, are exactly where they belong," he said firmly. In the past, he helped her to her feet, supporting her wounded arm. "Besides, we need to build our own memories now." The cabin collapsed in on itself with a shower of sparks, but Ophelia felt no sadness. "Sometimes you had to burn down the old to make room for the new. Where do we go now?" she asked. Caspian looked down at her, love and determination warring in his storm-gray eyes. "Anywhere we want. We're free, Ophelia. Finally, truly free." 6 months later, the little church in Sage Springs was decorated with wildflowers and filled with the warm buzz of celebration. Ophelia stood before the cracked mirror in the back room, adjusting the simple white dress that Caspian's sister Cordelia had sewn for her. "You look beautiful," Cordelia said, pinning a crown of mountain laurel in Ophelia's auburn hair. "Though I still can't believe my wandering brother is finally settling down." Ophelia smiled, touching the silver locket at her throat. Caspian's wedding gift to her, containing a pressed flower from the meadow where he'd first told her he loved her. "Neither can I sometimes." The past months had been a whirlwind of building their new life together. True to his word, Caspian had brought her to Sage Springs, where Cordelia ran a boarding house that had become a sanctuary for women starting over. But instead of leaving Ophelia there and drifting on as planned, Caspian had stayed at first. He'd told himself it was just until she was fully healed and settled. Then it was until he was sure Blackthorn's remaining men weren't still hunting them. But as weeks turned to months, he'd finally admitted the truth: he couldn't bear to leave her. "Mrs. Wolfe," Ophelia whispered to her reflection, testing how the name sounded. Perfect. It sounded perfect. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Time to go, sweetheart," came Caspian's voice from the other side. "You're not supposed to see her before the ceremony," Cordelia protested, but she was laughing. "I'm not looking, just talking. Besides, I've seen her in a lot worse situations than a wedding dress." Ophelia opened the door just enough to slip her hand through. Caspian's fingers intertwined with hers immediately, warm and calloused and wonderfully familiar. "Having second thoughts?" she asked teasingly. "About marrying the woman who saved my life, helped me rebuild my ranch, and makes the best damn biscuits in 3 counties? Not a chance." His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "You. Only about whether Pastor Williams will get through the ceremony without falling asleep? He is 87. Caspian's laughter rumbled through the thin door. "If he nods off, we'll just pronounce ourselves married. I've waited long enough to call you my wife." The ceremony was simple but perfect. Pastor Williams managed to stay awake through the entire service, though he did nod off briefly during his own closing prayer. The small congregation, mostly Cordelia's boarding house ladies, and a few local friends laughed and wiped away tears as Caspian and Ophelia exchanged vows they'd written themselves. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Ophelia said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "To stand with you against whatever storms may come, and to love you with everything I am for all the days of my life." Caspian's voice was rough with emotion as he replied, "I promise to protect you, cherish you, and love you not because I saved you from that auction, but because you saved me from a life of running from happiness. You are my home, Ophelia. You always will be." When Pastor Williams finally pronounced them husband and wife, Caspian's kiss was tender and full of promise. The small congregation erupted in cheers, and someone, probably Cordelia, threw rice that scattered across the wooden floor of the little church. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Ophelia found herself swept around the parlor by various well-wishers, but her eyes kept finding Caspian across the room. Every time their gazes met, he smiled that slow, devastating smile that still made her heart skip beats as the evening wound down and the last guests departed. Caspian and Ophelia finally found themselves alone on the boarding house's front porch. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain sky, and somewhere in the distance a nightbird called to its mate. "Happy?" Caspian asked, settling beside her on the porch swing. Ophelia curled up against his side, marveling at how perfectly she fit there, deliriously. "Though I keep expecting someone to tell me it's all a dream. If it is, I don't want to wake up." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Wolfe?" Home. Their ranch was small but growing, built on land they'd purchased with the reward money from turning in Blackthorn's remaining gang members to the territorial marshal. It wasn't much yet, a modest house, a barn, and enough acreage for a small herd, but it was theirs. "Ready," she said, but made no move to leave the comfortable circle of his arms. They sat in peaceful silence, watching the stars and planning their future. Tomorrow, they would start their lives as husband and wife, building something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of their individual pasts. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been at that auction?" Ophelia asked. Caspian considered this seriously. "I think we would have found each other anyway. Maybe not that day, maybe not in that place, but somehow. Some people are just meant to be together. Even if one of them was in a cage at the time, especially then." He tilted her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "You were never really caged, you know? Your spirit was too wild, too fierce. You just needed someone to unlock the door. And you needed someone to convince you to stop running long enough to be happy. Perfect match then." As they finally made their way home under the star-filled sky, Ophelia reflected on the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, she'd been alone and desperate, facing a future she couldn't bear to imagine. Now she was married to a man who loved her fierce independence as much as her gentle heart, building a life that felt like the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. The drifter had found her in a cage. But in freeing her, he'd freed himself as well. And sometimes Ophelia thought as Caspian helped her down from their wagon in front of their own front door. That was exactly how love was supposed to work. Two broken people making each other whole. Two lost souls finding their way home together. Their story had begun with bars and auctions and desperate circumstances. But it was ending with promises and possibilities and a future bright enough to outshine all the stars in the Montana sky.